Hi, welcome to session 10, and in this session we're focusing on communicating, reporting, and disseminating evaluation results. In session 8, we've looked at the methods and approaches for collecting the data that you need to be able to answer the evaluation questions. And in session 9, we looked at how the collected data would be analyzed to be able to come up with findings supported by evidence, and then use the findings and evidence to make recommendations and conclusions. So in this session, we are focusing on how evaluation reports, final evaluation reports could be made, and the information made available for intended users to be able to facilitate utilization, okay, for policy improvements and so on. So in this session, we are focusing on evaluation outputs, evaluation report, content and structure, dissemination of findings, communications to communication channels, and facilitating evaluation utilization, but also evaluation synthesis, thematic reviews, and meta-analysis. A reminder again is that the whole process, the whole system we have been looking at from session 1 up to session 9, we are looking at systematic, impartial, objective examination of humanitarian actions or interventions. And the whole idea is that you come up with recommendations and conclusions from which certain lessons can be drawn by intended users to be able to improve policy and learn from those lessons to improve practices, but also enhance accountability. So we have traveled from the phase of deciding to evaluate, of course, following implementation of a humanitarian intervention, through selecting, designing questions to be evaluated, selecting the team, doing inception report, briefing people the team before going to the field, collecting data, and then coming up with, analyzing data, and then coming up with an evaluation report. And that is where we stopped in session 9. So in this session 10, we are focusing on the evaluation report, content, and dissemination. Okay, so reporting and communicating with evaluation findings or recommendations with a utilization focus. Do we know the primary intended users of the evaluation findings? How do we communicate, facilitate the use of the findings? How do we present the information to the users? And again, what particular products or outputs should be made available for specific intended users? So let's begin with evaluation report outputs. Evaluation outputs. So you have the inception report, which was done before the evaluation is done. Advice provided directly in the field when you are in the field. Debriefing workshops regarding field work and information that is to be collected or that is collected. Debriefing notes. You can also have draft evaluation reports that can be discussed with the managers and other stakeholders, and then come up with the final evaluation report. So the inception report, you have it at planning stage. You have the advice provided directed in the field, which is done during field work, and then you have debriefing workshops that are done during field work. So debriefing workshops and of course advice provided is due with to make sure that you collected data that is relevant, okay, or that would be later on used. And then you have debriefing notes, which are done at the end of the field work, and maybe they could be done by peers to advise on how to write the report and what kind of report is needed, and so on. And then you have the draft of the evaluation report, which is done by the evaluation team weeks after the fieldwork or after collecting data, or if you use secondary data after secondary desk reviews, and then the final evaluation report is done weeks following the draft discussion. So let's talk about the evaluation report. So this has to do with presenting evaluation processes, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So in other words, the evaluation report is not only presenting um, the conclusions and recommendations and findings, but it is also presenting how the evaluation process began, including the purpose, objectives, evaluation questions, and methodologies and analysis, and how the evaluation information was analyzed. And so it presents the entire process that was followed to be able to come up with the data or recommendations and conclusions that you have. There is no fixed format. The formats vary across agencies. So the Red Cross can have its own, the UN agencies can have the general one, but even UN agencies, each of them could have its own. UNICEF could have its own. World Health Organization could have its own. World Food Organization could have its own, and so on. Even the local NGOs that are working in humanitarian intervention implementation also have their own formats. So it doesn't matter. It depends on each agency. But the main considerations have to do with the report quality. What does it have? How is it made? When was it made available, and so on? When was it made, and so on? The length, short or long. Of course, short reports are more likely to be read and therefore information used compared to long reports. Yes, longer reports can be done by the evaluation team, but then they can be catalogued for references. Okay, but then it is better to make short reviews, or maybe you could call it the way policy reviews are made, so for better consumption. Okay, and they should contain sufficient evidence. So this is the structure of the evaluation report. Remember, we've said that there is no universal standard. Okay, there are variations, but at least the report should have a title page or cover page, if you will, preliminary pages that look at issues of maybe acknowledgement, forward, preface, executive summary, and so on. Introduction that gives the background to the evaluation, methods that explain the methods and methodologies that designs and methodologies that were used, content, how it was analyzed. How the content was analyzed, the main sections, of course, considering evaluation purpose, criteria, and the rest, and then conclusions and recommendations. You can see, of course, session 9 on how recommendations can be written. So, how do you make your report more engaging? You can use subtitles, titles, bold or italicized to make certain content important. You can do pull out quotes, whereby you enlarge some those of those quotations that you think should capture the attention of the audience. You can use boxes, maybe to present case studies, case examples. Okay, you can use photographs to maybe as evidence to support certain findings. You could use stories, maybe from the participants. You could use graphics or tables to make summaries, and especially for statistic data. And then you can use, for instance, visualization, such as videos, leaflets, or flyers, or and so on. Okay, so the audience is different. While your evaluation is targeting certain intended users, the intended users have divergences. divergences in terms of characteristics, and divergences in terms of the need for your evaluation. Okay, so you can consider detailed simplifications for certain audiences. You can use certain language for certain audiences, even if it means even translating your English report into small briefs that are in certain languages. For instance, if you're targeting information to maybe the local readers, then you might need also to translate the information into local language. The length matters. Remember, the longer it is, to read, the less chances of being used or of all the recommendations to be taken up. Consider implications in terms of audience. Ethical implications also matter. Okay, for instance, you do not want to communicate certain information that certain audience is not supposed to know. Okay, and then the intended uses are important. Discussion of draft report must be made, of course, in consultation with stakeholders, saturated among those that are important, managers, evaluation managers, because they intend to they are direct users. Discussing and responding to factual errors, and ensuring that the quality is maintained according to the reporting standards of a certain agency. And also, of course, the purpose of discussion of draft reports is to make sure that at the end of the day, if you make a final report, then different stakeholders own it. Okay, because they know they've discussed the content, the ideas are there, the suggestions they made, they are in. And then, of course, do we include the affected people? Of course, but rarely the affected people are included in the discussions of reports. But it's very important, because discussion with the affected people helps you to confirm certain findings and certain recommendations. Okay, it is very, very important that the affected people are included. But of course, at the level of involving affected people also depends on the kind of evaluation that is being done. If, for instance, the evaluation was done on recovery projects or reconstruction projects after disaster or after the crisis, it is very important that all the affected people mostly are involved, especially if you are using, for instance, the participatory methods that we discussed earlier on, whereby generation of findings and generation of reports and everything is done in a participatory manner. But when, for instance, we are dealing with interventions for emergency, humanitarian emergency, in that case, there is the time for engaging all stakeholders, including affected people, is very limited. Okay, but it is also important you could include their representatives. Then report finalizing and approval. So after discussion of the draft report, the report are finalized and a final report is done, and then it must be approved by, of course, the commissioning agencies or the managers, evaluation managers. Okay, so after responses are made to all comments that were made during draft discussion, management can do quality checks based on adequacy of the evidence and information, evidence supporting findings, the logic flow of the conclusions and recommendations, the relevance of recommendations based on findings, the reporting coherency depending on the standards of the reporting standards of a certain agency, but also the accessibility and readability in terms of clarity, in terms of language, and so on. And also, of course, the structure format according to recommended requirements. Okay. So after the report has been made, the final report has been made, dissemination is made. Of course, we all know that. Remember when we were talking about during planning phase, Budgets do not only look at implementation of the evaluation, but they also look at the after evaluation phase. And the after evaluation phase includes all the dissemination activities. So during budgeting and planning, a budget should be included for dissemination activities. So you consider during dissemination, you consider issues to do with stakeholder groups. What kind of groups do we have? What kind of audience do we have? Participants. The people affected who are receiving the humanitarian assistance, the funders, donors. You have the agency team members and so on. Even including the government officials that are within related agencies, such as maybe, for instance, in the Uganda's case, the office of the Prime Minister. You consider the information needs, the communication means. How do they get the information? Is it through media? Is it through actual distribution in their offices? How do they get? Is it through workshops and so on? Consider users' limitations to access information, maybe in raw settings or in or distribution methods. Dissemination timing. What is the timing? If you want to disseminate information through community sensitization and creation awareness creation within refugee camps or zones, when do you do it? The timing must be very important. For instance, if you want to do that in certain zones, then in the morning hours, maybe the refugees or the affected people are busy doing farming, and then you want to consider certain timing when they can be available for you. And then who will communicate? Is it the managers? Is it the evaluation team? Is it the experts? Is who must communicate the information? So all these are some of the considerations. And then designing a dissemination strategy, of course, is very, very important, but that is also mainly done by evaluation managers. And then there is communication and giving feedback, of course, including in-country interviewees, which are the affected people. So the communication channels are very important, and the communication channels can be one-on-one through meetings, personal communications, or briefings. You know where you're working at your workplace, you have those brief meetings and so on, especially on Mondays or Fridays or whatever. Audio visuals, where videos or podcasts or webinars are done. And in this time of coronavirus, of COVID-19 crisis, most agencies have now adopted the digital technologies, whereby webinars are done to talk to, communicate evaluation and so on. These internet-based options where you can use social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, as long as the intended users can be able to use such channels. And of course, use of agency websites where people can always go to find those evaluation reports. But you can also use evaluation databases where maybe agency staff can visit them to be able to rely on them to make certain improvements. So how do we then facilitate evaluation utilization? We can ensure that information that is supplied matches the demand. Okay, so make sure that you understand well the monitoring and evaluation system of a certain agency, involving stakeholders in the whole evaluation process from the beginning, planning and budgeting for dissemination activities. Because if you don't budget for them, then at the time of dissemination, you do not have funds to do so. And if you do not disseminate the information, then it cannot be used. Involve key users in formulating recommendations. So this has to do with the other discussion of drafts. okay, and making clarifications. You can use agency champions to foster action, such as certain team leaders within the agency. You can use findings to formulate training materials, but also allocate follow-up responsibilities to make sure that certain recommendations are being implemented for that purpose. So management can respond using management response matrix to refer to certain recommendations, or whether certain recommendations are being implemented or are being responded to. So the management response matrix contains records of how managers plan to respond to recommendations that have been made, okay? Because the agency, at the end of the day, commission the evaluation so that recommendation findings can be made, and then they can be learned. The agency can learn from those, and the responsibility is on the shoulders of the manager. So the manager can use management response matrix to make sure to trace and track how recommendations are being implemented or responded to or learned from. Okay, so the matrix communication roles and responsibilities, because those are within the recommendations that may be regarding food quality or procurement. The managers must also be part of the team to evaluate the quality according to the standards of World Food Program, something like that. Okay, so you have the recommendation. Whether managers can communicate whether there is more information needed, and in this case, remember, for instance, the recommendations were in a summative way. So in this case, you can refer back to the general report and get evidence, more information according to the responses or requirements of the management. Okay, and then how the management has been able to respond, the action taken, when was it taken, and then the response for unity. So in that case, you can track the management response matrix can track how recommendations are being utilized. So we have what we call evaluation of evaluations. When evaluation has been made, reports have been written, at the end of the day, sometimes managers want to confirm if the evaluation was done with quality, if the evaluation was done according to what was required, okay, or if the evaluation produces certain findings based on what was intended, and so on. Okay, so in other words, it's like evaluating evaluating the standards of the evaluation that was made. Okay, so users are interested in knowing more about a single or more evaluation studies. So in this case, if that need is there, then evaluation of evaluations or of a certain evaluation is done to analyze more studies in aggregation. Okay, so certain findings are restudied. Okay, if I may say. Okay, or maybe through what approaches were used to come up with certain findings in certain evaluation. So we have all different categories of approaches to evaluate evaluations. So you have evaluation synthesis, which is a systematic organization or summarizing or analysis of a set of findings in a certain maybe evaluation or others. So you can use systematic reviews, realist synthesis, and so on. You have thematic reviews, whereby it has to do with drawing findings and learning from a series of certain sectors. Okay, maybe health, The UN deals with clusters. Okay, so where there is cluster approach within the humanitarian system, you have clusters that deal with certain sectors, health, education, and so on. So a certain evaluation can be done on a certain aspect of a cluster. Then you have meta evaluations whereby certain a composition of a combination of different evaluations is done to be able to come up with a certain measures to look at maybe how different evaluations were done in certain contexts and what kind of findings came up. So users can be interested in knowing more about that, and then you have again evaluation. So you have evaluation synthesis. I've talked about that, and then you have thematic reviews. You have to draw findings, and then you have, of course, meta evaluations and so on. Bottom line is that again, if we refer to Patton's idea of utilization focused evaluation model, as he says in quotes, no matter how technically sound and methodologically elegant an evaluation is not truly a good evaluation unless the findings are used. So evaluation should be judged on its usefulness to its intended users and users. So ensure that whatever evaluation you do, whatever recommendations you are making, there is a likelihood of use for those findings, and decisions should be made to improve performance and so on. You can visit page 327 to 354 of Buchanan and others and learn more about this topic. Thank you.